The story of the Panzer myth doesn't begin with tanks rolling across open plains or engines roaring beneath steel hulls. It begins with an illusion, a carefully crafted belief that Germany had discovered the future of warfare while the rest of the world was still trapped in the past. And by the time Europe realized what had happened, it was already too late. In the years leading up to the Second World War, the German officer corps saw the catastrophic stagnation of trench warfare in World War I as a moral and intellectual failure, a failure of imagination. They believed wars were lost not by weak soldiers, but by weak doctrine, and the lesson they absorbed was simple: mobility was victory. Out of that belief emerged the philosophy that would shape the Panzer myth, the idea that small, highly trained armored formations led by aggressive officers and supported by rapid communications could break open enemy lines, shatter their command systems, and collapse their morale before slow-moving armies could react. Germany didn't merely build tanks. Every major power had tanks. What Germany built was a culture around them. Panzer commanders were not trained to follow procedures. They were trained to improvise, to hunt, to sense weakness and exploit it without waiting for permission. Radios were installed in nearly every German tank at a time when many Allied tanks still relied on flags or shouted commands. Junior officers were encouraged to act independently, to trust their instincts, to move faster than the enemy could think. This created a battlefield psychology unique to the Wehrmacht. Speed became not just a tactic, but an identity. From Poland in 1939 to France in 1940, the results seemed to justify everything the Germans believed. The French army had more tanks, many of them heavier and better armored than German panzers, yet it crumbled in 6 weeks because its doctrine was built for a different century. French generals positioned armor defensively, spread across sectors, tied to infantry formations and fixed lines. German armor, by contrast, massed at a single decisive point, broke through, and then plunged deep into operational space, severing communications, crossing rivers before engineers could react, overrunning headquarters, surrounding units that still believed they were safe. To the world watching from afar, it looked like magic, an unstoppable war machine born from technical superiority. But the truth was more subtle and, in many ways, more dangerous. The Panzer myth was not only a story the world believed, it was a story the Germans began to believe about themselves. They became convinced that doctrine alone made them invincible. The early victories in France and the opening months of Operation Barbarossa appeared to confirm that belief. Soviet divisions disintegrated under the weight of rapid encirclement. Whole armies vanished into pockets. Panzer groups drove hundreds of miles into enemy territory, advancing with a momentum that felt less like a military campaign and more like a natural disaster. German commanders believed they had solved the problem of war forever, that their system of decentralized initiative, tactical boldness, and armored exploitation had rendered traditional armies obsolete. But inside this triumph was a hidden flaw. The doctrine depended on momentum, on the enemy behaving exactly as expected, on psychological collapse replacing sustained resistance. It worked best against opponents who hesitated. It depended on fuel, spare parts, and endless mechanical endurance that Germany's industrial base could not sustain in a long war. Yet the myth masked these weaknesses, convincing the high command that more speed was always the answer, even when logistics screamed otherwise. The officers who had once questioned assumptions now defended them. The Panzer myth became not just doctrine, but dogma, and dogma is the enemy of adaptation. German generals looked at every new opponent, the Soviets, the British, and eventually the Americans, through the lens of early victories. They assumed other armies would react like France in 1940 or like the unprepared Soviet formations of 1941. They believed no enemy would learn quickly enough to counter their methods. They believed initiative belonged naturally, almost biologically, to German officers. They believed armor superiority was measured in spirit as much as in steel.
This mindset created a blind spot so large that it eventually swallowed their strategic reality. When American forces first entered Tunisia, their performance at Kasserine Pass seemed to confirm everything the Germans thought they knew. Inexperienced troops, rigid command structures, confused radio signals, retreat under pressure. To German observers, it was France all over again, another army psychologically unprepared for mobile warfare. Reports sent back to Berlin reinforced the illusion that the Panzer doctrine was still supreme, still unmatched, still the universal key to victory.
But while German commanders took comfort in yesterday's triumphs, the Americans did something that did not fit the myth. They learned. They studied their failure, replaced hesitant officers, reorganized artillery, rewrote tactical doctrine, and transformed themselves in weeks rather than years. That rapid evolution exposed the fatal weakness in the Panzer myth. It was built on the assumption that the enemy would remain static, predictable, and psychologically fragile. When the Americans at El Guetar stood firm, coordinated artillery, executed fighting withdrawals, and counterattacked with discipline instead of panic, German commanders confronted a reality they had never fully prepared for: an opponent who could absorb shock, adapt doctrine, and turn German strengths into vulnerabilities. The Panzer myth had defined early German victories, but by 1943 and 1944, it had become a cage, limiting innovation, blinding leadership, and convincing them that their greatest advantage could never be outmatched. Where Patton saw war as a fluid system, logistics, movement, tempo, coordination, German doctrine remained anchored to the belief that battlefield brilliance and armored daring alone would decide outcomes. The legacy of the Panzer myth, then, is not simply the story of tanks rolling through Europe. It is the story of how success created overconfidence, how doctrine hardened into ideology, and how an army that once reinvented warfare eventually failed to reinvent itself. It is the story of a powerful idea that triumphed brilliantly until the moment it met an enemy who refused to play the role the myth required, an enemy who turned speed into strategy, coordination into momentum, and who proved that no doctrine, no matter how legendary, survives unchanged when the war itself evolves faster than the men who believe they have already mastered it.
If the Panzer myth was built on the belief that war belonged to the daring tank commander racing ahead of the battlefield, then Patton's rise in France shattered that assumption by redefining what speed truly meant. Not the speed of a single armored column, but the speed of an entire army thinking and moving as one organism, a living machine powered by discipline, logistics, and relentless coordination. Patton never saw himself as the heroic duelist in a tank turret. He saw himself as the conductor of a mechanized orchestra in which artillery, infantry, armor, engineers, and air power struck together like synchronized thunder, every movement reinforcing the next. Where German doctrine elevated the bold initiative of the individual panzer leader, Patton elevated the momentum of the system. He believed that brilliance at the tactical level meant little if it didn't serve operational velocity, because wars were not won at the point of contact, but in the space behind the line, in the collapsed communications, the broken fuel chains, the commanders forced to react instead of decide. He demanded that artillery travel as fast as tanks, that logistics columns push forward even before roads were secure, that staff officers think not about where the front line was today, but where it would be tomorrow morning if the army refused to stop. His philosophy was ruthless toward hesitation. A unit that paused to reorganize risked becoming the anchor that slowed the entire momentum of the advance. To Patton, discipline was not about uniform rules or ceremony, though he enforced those with iron will. Discipline was about psychological readiness, about teaching soldiers that movement itself was a weapon, that fear lived in stillness, that aggressiveness was not emotional rage, but controlled forward motion.
This is what German officers misunderstood when they accused American forces of fighting mechanically. They believed Patton's army was a mass of machines because they could not see the intelligence inside the movement, the way radios linked battalions into a single neural network, the way artillery observers stitched the battlefield into a kill grid, the way logistics planners turned fuel and ammunition into operational energy. German tank commanders prided themselves on their ability to improvise under pressure, but they fought in a doctrine where improvisation was localized, episodic, heroic.
The story of the lone Panzer captain who seized an opportunity. Patton fought in a doctrine where improvisation scaled upward, where initiative existed everywhere at once, from the rifle platoon commander adjusting his attack to the corps staff identifying a breakout corridor before the enemy even realized it existed. German doctrine sought decisive engagements. Patton sought decisive movement. He wanted the enemy not crushed in a single great battle, but strangled in the constant shock of never being allowed to stabilize, never being given the time to counterattack, never knowing where the next blow would fall because the American army no longer attacked in straight lines. It flowed. This was the revolution German generals failed to see until it was too late. They believed the battlefield still belonged to the boldest tank, but Patton had elevated the battlefield to a higher dimension, one where victory belonged to the general who could turn his army into a storm that advanced faster than fear, faster than doctrine, faster than the enemy's capacity to understand what was happening to them. In that world, the lone Panzer hero was no longer the future. He was a relic.
When the breakout from Normandy finally came, it did not arrive as the Germans expected, not as a cautious advance, not as a measured push testing defenses sector by sector, but as a violent acceleration of history itself, a transformation of the battlefield from a place of static resistance into a landscape consumed by motion. And it was in that moment that Patton's doctrine and German Panzer philosophy collided head-on and revealed which of them belonged to the future. The German High Command waited for the familiar rhythm of war. The Allied thrust would advance a few miles, consolidate, reinforce, then pause, creating a predictable pattern that Panzer reserves could exploit through counterattack. Instead, once the American lines broke free of the hedgerows, Patton turned the map into a highway of opportunity. There was no consolidation, no pause, no psychological breathing room. Units that had fought all day were ordered to move all night. Reconnaissance screens raced ahead like arrows fired into the dark. Armored columns rolled through villages before German headquarters even knew those villages were threatened. German commanders kept asking the same question, where is the main attack? But Patton's genius was that there was no single main attack. Every spearhead had the potential to become the decisive one. Where German doctrine concentrated brilliance at the point of contact, Patton dispersed momentum across the entire operational front, forcing the Wehrmacht to defend everywhere and succeed nowhere. Panzer units, which had once thrived on striking surprised, disorganized opponents, now found themselves reacting to an enemy that refused to slow down long enough to become vulnerable. They counterattacked into empty space. They raced to block roads already bypassed. They prepared defensive positions for battles Patton had no intention of fighting, because while German tacticians were still thinking in terms of engagements, Patton was thinking in terms of flow. He didn't just maneuver around resistance, he rendered resistance meaningless by outpacing its relevance. By the time German armor assembled, the battlefield had already moved 30 miles east. Fuel convoys became targets, communications collapsed.
Units were cut off without ever being decisively engaged. It was not defeat in the romanticized sense of battlefield heroics or tank duels. It was defeat as a system failure, defeat as paralysis, defeat as the realization that the war was not just being fought faster, but being thought faster. For the Panzers, this was the moment the myth began to fracture. The strengths that had defined them, initiative, flexibility, tactical daring, still existed, but they no longer mattered.
because the battlefield had expanded beyond their scale of relevance. Against Patton, individual brilliance could not compensate for an opponent whose entire army possessed momentum as a collective instinct. German officers later described the feeling as fighting not an adversary, but a phenomenon, something fluid, ungraspable, ceaseless, a force that did not meet them where they stood, but swept past them, leaving them tactically alive, yet strategically defeated. And in that realization lay the quiet, devastating truth. The age of the lone armored hero was giving way to the age of coordinated velocity. And in that new world, Patton was not merely a commander, he was its architect. As Patton's advance surged across France, the collapse of German resistance was not simply the result of shattered formations or destroyed equipment. It was the erosion of will, the quiet breaking of an army that suddenly realized it was no longer fighting an opponent in front of it, but a relentless force pressing in from every direction at once. And nowhere was this more visible than in the growing psychological divide between German field commanders still clinging to the Panzer myth and the stark reality unfolding around them. The Panzers had once symbolized confidence, shock, mastery of the battlefield, yet now their deployments felt reactive, desperate, almost ceremonial, like relics being wheeled forward to preserve a narrative that no longer matched the war they were trapped inside. German officers reported that every time they attempted to stabilize a defensive line, the Americans simply appeared somewhere else, on the flank, in the rear, beyond the river that was supposed to buy time, and this constant dislocation produced a new kind of exhaustion, not physical, but existential, as if the battlefield itself had turned against them. Patton understood this better than his enemies. He wasn't only breaking positions, he was breaking expectations. His orders demanded movement not merely to seize ground, but to deny the Wehrmacht the psychological certainty required to plan, to breathe, to believe. Villages liberated without a fight, towns bypassed rather than besieged, road networks seized intact. Every decision chipped away at German morale because it revealed the futility of resistance. The Panzers could still counterattack with courage and skill, but their blows landed on ghosts, on maps already obsolete, on reports already outdated, on an enemy who never stayed where doctrine predicted he would stand and fight. The result was a creeping awareness among German staffs that their tactical competence no longer translated into strategic relevance. They could win skirmishes while still losing time, and time had become the decisive terrain of the war. Patton's army, fueled by logistics, radio coordination, and an almost fanatical insistence on forward motion, acted like a pressure system collapsing the operational space in which German initiative once flourished. Even victories felt hollow, because no matter how many tanks survived a counterstrike, the front had already shifted. Bridges lost, crossroads swallowed, supply lines stretched to breaking. Soldiers spoke of feeling pursued not by men, but by inevitability. And this was the essence of Patton's transformation of modern warfare. He did not merely defeat formations.
He dismantled the enemy's belief that battle itself could still shape the outcome. In that moment, the myth of the decisive armored clash, the heroic Panzer stand, dissolved into a harsher truth. Wars of the future would not be decided by who fought the bravest engagement, but by who mastered the rhythm of movement. And under that rhythm, the Wehrmacht's legend began to fade like a story outpaced by reality.
If the Germans still believed that victory belonged to the army with the strongest tanks or the bravest commanders, Patton proved instead that modern war belonged to the army that could feed its own momentum. And nowhere was this clearer than in the vast logistical machine that powered his advance, a system so relentless and adaptive that it turned fuel, ammunition, bridges, and roadways into instruments of strategy every bit as decisive as guns and armor. Patton understood that an army didn't slow down because it lacked courage, it slowed down because it ran out of motion,
and motion required gasoline, tires, spare parts, food, and communication flowing with the same urgency as the tanks themselves. To him, logistics was not a background function, but the heartbeat of operational warfare, and he treated supply convoys with the same intensity that other commanders reserved for elite combat units. Trucks became the real engines of conquest, roaring across liberated roads at breakneck pace, headlights blacked out at night, drivers risking ambush and exhaustion because Patton's doctrine demanded that the advance never suffer the indignity of stopping for want of fuel. Engineers built bridges before anyone even confirmed whether the enemy still held the opposite bank. Maintenance crews repaired tanks while they were still warm from combat. Staff officers mapped fuel consumption as carefully as maneuver routes because in Patton's mind, logistics was not an obstacle to bold strategy. It was what made bold strategy possible. This was the dimension German Panzer doctrine had never fully reconciled. They romanticized the battlefield moment, the decisive clash of armor and nerve, but their logistical networks lagged behind their ambition, and as the war shifted into the scale of armies rather than spearheads, that gap became fatal. Patton's forces could advance faster than German intelligence could react because the infrastructure of movement followed close behind like an industrial tide, turning captured territory into operational depth almost instantly. Rail yards were seized and converted, fuel depots re-established, roads redirected to serve the advance instead of the retreat, and through this constant transformation, the battlefield itself seemed to bend in Patton's favor. German commanders complained that the Americans fought with endless resources, but what they were truly witnessing was not abundance, it was organization elevated into a weapon. The realization that in mechanized warfare, the most powerful formation is not the spearhead at the front, but the invisible river of support surging behind it. And as the Wehrmacht's fuel dwindled, as its tanks became stranded monuments to a doctrine that could no longer sustain itself, the contrast became undeniable. The Panzers still embodied courage and tactical brilliance, but Patton's army embodied continuity, the ability to transform speed into endurance, movement into permanence, advance into inevitability. In that revelation lay the great shift of the modern battlefield, the understanding that the future would not belong to the commander who fought the most dramatic battle, but to the one who could make sure his army never had to stop fighting at all. As Patton's campaign unfolded, the true depth of his revolution in warfare emerged not merely from speed or logistics, but from his ability to cultivate an environment where adaptability itself became doctrine, where every officer and unit understood that the battlefield was a living, unstable reality that rewarded those who could think forward while moving forward. And this philosophy stood in stark contrast to the German command system, which, despite its celebrated reputation for initiative, increasingly found itself constrained by the collapsing structure of a war it could no longer control. Patton pushed his subordinates to act aggressively, without waiting for permission. Yet, unlike the mythologized independence of the Panzer commander, his version of initiative existed within a larger, constantly shifting design, a network of intent that allowed thousands of decisions to align toward the same direction even when communications lagged or conditions changed. Orders were not rigid plans, but vectors of purpose. Seize momentum, maintain pressure, bypass resistance, exploit weakness. And because every level of command internalized these principles, the army could absorb chaos without losing rhythm. Bridges destroyed, units detoured and found another crossing. Roads clogged, columns fanned out, improvising new routes across fields and secondary lanes. Enemy unexpectedly strong in one sector, the attack did not halt, it flowed around the strength and struck somewhere else. This fluidity stunned German commanders who had once believed themselves masters of operational flexibility. Now they found the Americans shifting posture faster than their intelligence networks could even report where the strikes originated.
Patton's staff culture encouraged creative problem-solving, but always in service of momentum. Hesitation was treated as a greater danger than error because mistakes could be corrected by movement, while stagnation gifted the enemy time, and time had become the rarest resource of the war. Meanwhile, the German system, strained by fuel shortages, fragmented communications, and the increasing intrusion of political authority into military decision-making, began to lose the very adaptability that had once defined Blitzkrieg, trapping capable officers inside an environment where initiative no longer scaled. Patton, by contrast, had built an army that could change direction without losing cohesion, that could transform setbacks into acceleration, that could reinterpret every obstacle as an invitation to outthink the enemy in real time. And in this widening gap between reactive defense and proactive motion lay the quiet turning point of the campaign.
The realization that modern warfare would not be won simply by the army that struck hardest, but by the army that could continuously reinvent the battle while still fighting it, bending uncertainty into advantage, turning improvisation from a desperate necessity into a disciplined instinct. And in that realm, Patton's forces no longer merely advanced, they evolved.
In the final measure of Patton's campaign, what emerged was not merely a record of ground gained or battles won, but a deeper transformation in the very meaning of power on the modern battlefield. A realization that the age of heroic, individualized warfare, symbolized by the Panzer commander, had given way to an era where victory was created not by singular acts of brilliance, but by the orchestration of entire systems, by the fusion of technology, doctrine, psychology, and momentum into a unified instrument of relentless pressure. And nowhere did this truth reveal itself more starkly than in the closing stages of the drive across Europe, when German forces, though still capable of fierce resistance, found themselves fighting not simply an enemy army, but the logic of a new form of war that rendered their strengths obsolete. Patton did not seek glory through climactic duels or theatrical confrontations. He sought inevitability, the slow tightening of operational reality until the enemy no longer possessed meaningful choices, only reactions, only retreats disguised as counterattacks, only sacrifices made to delay an outcome already racing ahead of them. His genius lay not in a single victory, but in the continuity between them. In the way each advance fed the next, each breakthrough reshaped the terrain of decision-making, each movement degraded the enemy's capacity to think strategically. By the time the Panzers stood to fight their last battles, they were no longer instruments of shock, but symbols of resistance to a past form of warfare, powerful, courageous, tactically impressive, yet tragically misaligned with the scale and tempo of the conflict that now surrounded them. Patton's armies did not defeat them because they were stronger at the point of contact.
They defeated them because the point of contact no longer mattered as much as the velocity of events beyond it. This was the quiet, unsettling revelation of the campaign, that modern war had shifted from contests of strength to contests of speed and integration, from bold leaders charging forward to vast networks of soldiers, machines, and ideas moving in harmony toward a common purpose. And as the dust settled over roads that had once carried tanks like thunder, the deeper historical truth became clear. Patton's legacy was not merely that he outran his enemies, but that he outran an entire generation's understanding of how war was supposed to be fought, leaving behind not just defeated armies, but a shattered mythology, and in its place, a new doctrine shaped by movement, organization, and the relentless forward momentum of a world that would never again fight at the pace of the past.